The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, and I almost didn't answer it. I was standing in my kitchen in Guelph, Ontario, pouring my second cup of coffee, watching the rain streak down the window over the backyard. The maple tree I'd planted with my wife 31 years ago had gone full red. I remember thinking it was the best it had ever looked. Then my phone buzzed on the counter, and I saw my daughter-in-law's name on the screen. I should have felt something. A tightening, maybe. A small warning bell somewhere in the back of my mind. Instead, I just picked it up. "Dad," she said. And she always called me that, even though I'd never asked her to. "We need to talk about something. About you." That was the last normal moment I remember for a very long time. My name is Theodore Ainsworth. I'm 67 years old. For 34 years, I worked as a structural engineer at a mid-size firm in Guelph. I designed bridges, overpasses, municipal drainage systems. Nothing glamorous, but solid work. Work that held things up. My wife, Rosalind, died of ovarian cancer 11 years ago, and after that it was just me in the house on Cromwell Street and whatever distance my son chose to put between us in any given month. My son is 38. He works in financial planning in Toronto. He married his wife. I'll call her what she told me to call her from the start, which was nothing I'd say out loud in polite company now. 5 years ago at a venue in Niagara-on-the-Lake that cost more than my first car. I paid for a third of it. I did not complain. I want to be honest about this part, because I've had a lot of time to sit with it. My son and I were never close in the easy way some fathers and sons are. After Rosalind died, something calcified between us. He grieved differently than I did, or maybe he didn't grieve at all. I couldn't tell, and he wouldn't tell me. He moved to Toronto. He called on holidays. He visited twice a year, sometimes 3 times, always with his wife, always for exactly as long as was required to say he had. I thought that was just how things were between us now. I was wrong about what it actually meant. The conversation that October morning lasted about 20 minutes. My daughter-in-law did most of the talking. She said she and my son had been worried about me for a while. She mentioned a few things. A phone call in which I'd apparently repeated myself. A visit during which I'd left the stove element on after making tea. A moment at my grandson's birthday party in August, where I'd called my son by my own brother's name. My brother Dennis, who my son has always resembled. Who I had been thinking about that day, because it would have been his 65th birthday. That context I had apparently never provided. She said they'd spoken to someone. A doctor, she said, though she was vague about who and where. She said the consensus was that it might be time to think about a transition, a place where I'd have support, where I wouldn't be alone in that big house. I told her I wasn't interested in any transition. I told her I was fine. I told her I'd seen my own GP 3 months prior for a routine physical and Dr. Whitaker had found nothing concerning whatsoever, she said gently. That sometimes these things moved quickly. I hung up feeling irritated and slightly uneasy. The way you feel after someone tells you there's a spider somewhere in the room but won't say exactly where. 2 weeks later, my son drove up from Toronto on a Sunday. He took me to lunch at a restaurant I like on Wyndham Street. The kind of gesture that should have felt like kindness but felt, in retrospect, like staging. He ordered for both of us. He asked about my neighbor's renovation. He asked whether I was still doing my morning walks. Then, over coffee, he slid a manila folder across the table and said there were some documents he'd like me to look at. They were financial documents, a proposed power of attorney arrangement. He explained it calmly, in the measured tone he uses with clients, I imagine, the tone that implies he's already thought of every objection you might have and found it wanting. He said it was just a precaution, said it would make things easier if anything ever happened, said Rosalind would have wanted him to look out for me. That last part landed wrong. He knew it. I saw it in the way he picked up his coffee cup immediately after saying it, not drinking, just holding it. I told him I'd look at the documents. I did not sign them that day. What I did instead when I got home was call my own lawyer, a woman I've worked with for 15 years on property matters, named Geraldine, and ask her to look them over. She called me back the following Thursday. Her exact words were, "Ted, this is quite broad. I'd like to talk to you before you do anything with this." We met on a Friday afternoon. She walked me through what the document actually authorized. It was not a standard precautionary power of attorney. It included provisions that would have given my son authority over property transactions, banking, and medical decisions simultaneously, with minimal oversight requirements. She said she'd seen similar documents, occasionally, in cases that later became elder law disputes. I drove home that evening thinking I had misunderstood my son. I had not misunderstood my son. I had merely not yet understood the full extent of what he was planning. 3 weeks after the lunch on Wyndham Street, I woke up at what I later learned was 2:30 in the afternoon, in a room I did not recognize. The ceiling was white with a water stain in the shape of something I couldn't name. There were curtains the color of old mustard. There was a TV mounted high on the wall, turned off. There was a call button on a cord draped over the bed rail. A bed rail. I was in a bed with a bed rail. I lay there for what felt like a long time, doing inventory. I knew who I was. I knew what year it was. I knew the name of the Prime Minister, and the capital of every province, and the street I had lived on for 29 years. I knew all of it. What I did not know was how I had come to be lying in this bed, in this room, with an IV line taped to the inside of my left elbow. I pressed the call button. A nurse came in. Young woman, professional, pleasant in the careful way that people are pleasant when they've been trained to manage alarming situations without confirming that anything is alarming. She told me I was at Maplewood Gardens, which she described as a continuing care community. She told me I'd been there for 4 days. She used the word comfortable 3 times in about 9 seconds. I asked her what was wrong with me. She said the admitting physician would come to speak with me. I asked for my phone. She said my personal belongings had been collected by my family for safekeeping. I asked her to call my son. She said my son had already been notified that I was awake. I asked her to call Geraldine. She hesitated, just for a moment. Then she said she'd pass the message along. The admitting physician came an hour later. He introduced himself, told me he'd reviewed my file, and said that the facility was glad I was more alert. He used the phrase cognitive episode. He mentioned that the transition period could be disorienting. He spoke in the careful grammar of someone reading slightly off a script. I told him I wanted to see my file. He said he'd arrange that. I told him I wanted to contact my lawyer. He said that was absolutely my right. I told him I had not agreed to be admitted to this facility. He said that sometimes in situations of acute need, family members made decisions on behalf of their loved ones. I said, I have not given anyone power of attorney. He looked at the chart. He looked at me. Then he said, carefully, the documentation we received indicated otherwise. I need to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. It wasn't panic. It wasn't confusion. It was something colder and quieter than either of those. It was the specific feeling of understanding that you have been outmaneuvered, deliberately and carefully, by someone who has had longer to plan than you have. My son had submitted documentation claiming power of attorney. I had not signed those documents, but he had them anyway. The next 2 days were the longest of my life. I was coherent. I was calm, or I made myself calm, because I understood instinctively that any distress on my part would be categorized as evidence of the diagnosis they had apparently given me. I asked questions politely. I requested things in writing. I ate the meals they brought. I did the cognitive assessments when the occupational therapist came, answering every question correctly, and I watched her write things down that I could not see. My son visited on the 2nd day. He sat in the chair by the window and told me he'd done what he had to do. He said I hadn't been well. He said I'd been a danger to myself. He said it was temporary, that we'd revisit the arrangement in a few months, that he just needed some time to sort out a few things. I asked him what things. He said the house needed some repairs, and it made more sense to take care of it while I was somewhere safe. I asked him who was authorized to make decisions about the house. He looked out the window. He said the POA covered property matters. I said, I did not sign that document. He said, you were having an episode when we discussed it. You may not remember. That was the moment I knew exactly what I was dealing with. And I knew, with a clarity that I will remember for the rest of my life, that I was not going to let it stand. What saved me was 2 things, my neighbor and a blood test. My neighbor is a retired nurse named Greta, not a woman you'd want to argue with under any circumstances, who had a key to my house for emergencies, and who noticed immediately that I had not put out my recycling bin on Wednesday, which I had done every single Wednesday for 11 years. She called my cell. My daughter-in-law answered and told her I was resting at a family property. Greta did not find this convincing. She called the non-emergency police line and reported a concern. The constable who came to do a wellness check at Maplewood Gardens was named Singh, and he was, I believe, the first person in 4 days who looked at me and saw a man rather than a file. He sat with me for 40 minutes. He let me talk. He wrote things down. Before he left, he said he couldn't make any determinations, but that he was going to note that I had communicated clearly, consistently, and without any indication of cognitive impairment, and that I had explicitly stated I did not consent to being in the facility. He also strongly suggested I request an independent medical assessment. The independent physician who came the following morning ordered a full blood work panel. Standard, she said, for any new long-term care admission, which, she noted, my file did not actually classify me as. She was thorough. She asked about medications. I told her I hadn't taken anything voluntarily except the IV fluids and what I'd been told was a blood pressure medication. She made a note. The results came back 36 hours later. There was a sedative compound in my system, a benzodiazepine, at a level inconsistent with any medication I had been prescribed, in any dosage, at any point in my medical history. The admitting physician could not explain it. The facility's medication records showed nothing that should have produced that level, which meant it had been administered to me before I arrived. I want to pause here and tell you something that I think is important, especially if you're watching this and you're older, and you have children, and you've quietly worried about this kind of thing in the back of your mind. The drug in my system explained everything. The cognitive episode they had documented, the confusion my son had reported to the admitting physician, the reason I had no memory of being transported to Maplewood Gardens. Someone had given me something that made me appear, to anyone looking at a chart rather than at me, like a man in the early stages of a serious cognitive decline. I do not know exactly when or how it happened. My best guess, and Geraldine's, and the detectives', is the coffee. My son made coffee when he arrived that Sunday afternoon, 3 days before I found myself in that room with the mustard curtains. I thought nothing of it. He'd made coffee in my kitchen 100 times. The forgery was less sophisticated than the drugging, which is what ultimately undid him. He had not used a lawyer. He had used a document preparation service, the kind that fills in templates, and the power of attorney he had submitted to Maplewood Gardens had several irregularities that Geraldine identified within about 20 minutes of seeing it. The witnessing signatures were improper under Ontario law. The notarization was from a commissioner of oaths in Mississauga who, when contacted, had no record of the appointment. Geraldine filed an emergency application to the court. I was discharged from Maplewood Gardens 11 days after I had arrived. I walked out on a gray November morning with a bag of clothes Greta had brought me, and I stood in the parking lot and breathed cold air for about 30 seconds before I got in her car. I did not cry. I was saving that for later. The house, when I got back to it, was not the same house I had left. He had not sold it, not yet. But he had begun the process. There was a lockbox on the front door, a real estate lockbox, the kind agents use for showings. The locks had been changed. I had to call the police to enter my own home, a sentence I still find surreal to type. Inside, things had been moved, not dramatically, not ransacked, but rearranged in the way of someone who has been walking through a property thinking about square footage rather than about the life lived in it. Rosalind's writing desk, which had been in the study, was in the hallway. The boxes of her books that I kept in the spare room had been moved to the garage. Several of them were in a pile that looked like it had been sorted for donation. I stood in the study for a long time. Then I called Geraldine. The investigation took 4 months. The Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit became involved once the scope of what my son had planned became clear. He had already been in contact with a real estate agent, a woman his wife had gone to university with, about listing the house. He had opened a separate bank account under a numbered company, into which the proceeds were intended to flow. My own bank accounts had been accessed, not emptied, but monitored. The access authorized by the fraudulent POA document he had submitted to the financial institution, along with a copy of what appeared to be my signature. My son is methodical. He plans things carefully. He had apparently been planning this for somewhere between 8 and 14 months. What he had not planned for was Greta's recycling bin observation, or a blood test, or the fact that I had retained Geraldine 3 weeks before any of this happened, and that she had already documented her concerns about the original POA document in writing. The paper trail, once the police started pulling it, was extensive. His wife, my daughter-in-law, had known. Not every detail, perhaps, but enough. She had made the call to me in October. She had been the one to speak to the facility in advance of my admission. Her phone records showed 19 calls to Maplewood Gardens in the 2 weeks before I arrived there. She had known. My son was charged with fraud over $5,000, uttering a forged document, and criminal negligence causing bodily harm. The last count related to the administration of a controlled substance without consent. In Canada, these are serious charges. His lawyer spent considerable effort trying to negotiate them down. He was unsuccessful. My son pleaded guilty on 2 counts and was sentenced to 3 years in federal custody. His wife faced separate charges related to the conspiracy. She took a plea as well, 2 years less a day to be served conditionally with 3 years probation. Neither of them will work in financial services again. The numbered company was dissolved. The real estate agent cooperated fully with investigators and was not charged. The house on Cromwell Street is still mine. I have a grandson. He is 8 years old. His name is Owen, and yes, that's his father's middle name. A fact that has become more complicated for me since all of this. He doesn't fully understand what happened. He knows his father isn't around. He knows his grandfather had to go somewhere for a while and then came back. His maternal grandmother has been caring for him, and she's a decent woman who had no part in any of this, and I am grateful for that. I see him on video call on Sunday mornings. We talk about hockey. He's playing his first year of tyke, and about a game he likes on the tablet, and sometimes about nothing in particular. He has Rosalind's eyes. That's the part that gets me when I think about it too carefully. I want to tell you what I have learned, because I think this is the part that matters most. What happened to me is not rare. The Canadian Centre for Elder Law estimates that financial abuse is the most common form of elder abuse in this country, and that in the majority of cases, the perpetrator is a family member. Power of attorney fraud, in particular, is one of the fastest-growing categories of financial crime among Canadians over 60. It is underreported because people are ashamed, or because they do not want to believe what their own children are capable of, or because they have already lost the resources to fight it. I was 67 years old, physically healthy, mentally sharp, and living independently in my own home. It still almost happened to me. If Greta hadn't noticed the recycling bin, I do not know how long I would have been in that facility before anyone looked closely enough to question the paperwork. There are things I want you to know. If someone, anyone, including your children, presents you with a power of attorney document and creates any kind of pressure to sign it quickly, stop. Call your own lawyer. Not a family lawyer, not a shared lawyer. Your own independent lawyer who represents only your interests. In Ontario, a proper enduring power of attorney for property must be signed in the presence of a witness who is not your spouse or partner, not a child, not your attorney, and not someone who will benefit from your estate. If any of those conditions are not met, the document is invalid. If you are ever placed in a care facility without your clear and informed consent, you have the right to an independent medical assessment. You have the right to contact a lawyer. You have the right to contact the Advocacy Centre for the Elderly, which operates in Ontario and can intervene on your behalf. These rights do not disappear because a family member has submitted paperwork on your behalf. Trust the people in your life who pay attention to small things. Greta noticed a recycling bin. That is not a small thing. That is everything. I am back in my house on Cromwell Street. The maple tree in the backyard is bare now. It's February as I'm recording this, and the yard looks the way February always looks in Ontario, which is to say like a long gray argument with itself. I've reframed some of Rosalind's photographs and put them back on the study wall. I've started working on a raised garden bed for the spring. I sleep in my own bed. I have not forgiven my son. I want to be honest about that too. I'm not sure forgiveness is the word for what I'm working toward. I think the word might be something closer to release, or to carrying it differently. There is a version of this in which I spend whatever years I have left bent under the weight of what he did. I am not willing to live that version. He made a choice. It was a specific, deliberate, calculated choice, made over months, and it nearly worked. I cannot pretend that the boy I raised didn't become the man who did that to me. Both of those things are true simultaneously. I am learning to hold them both without one canceling out the other. What I know for certain is this. I woke up in a room I did not recognize, in a facility I had not chosen, stripped of my phone and my keys and my autonomy, and told that my memory was failing. Every instinct I had said that was wrong. I held on to that. I did not let anyone else's paperwork override what I knew to be true about my own mind. If you are watching this and something feels wrong, in your situation, in your family, in the documents being put in front of you, hold on to that feeling. It is not paranoia. It is information. Act on it before someone else acts for you. You built your life. It belongs to you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.